Welcome back, biologists. We're going to continue our Tree of Life lecture. This is part number 2. We've already covered 3 phyla so far. We've covered the Porphyrians, the Cnidarians, and the Platyhelminthes. And now we're going to jump all the way to slide number 49, where our little character here is going to take us to the next group, the mollusks. So phylum Mollusca is our 4th phylum that we're going to cover. These guys are quite interesting. They're one of my favorite groups. These guys all exhibit bilateral symmetry. That is, they have a true head end, at least most of them do. They're also triploblastic, so they have 3 cell layers. And these guys also possess a shell, a mantle cavity, and the mantle cavity is the soft tissue that actually secretes the shell, and they can use their mantle cavity for gas exchange. And if you've ever followed that snail that's crawling across your grass in the morning, he's crawling on what we're calling a foot. It's a muscular organ that can be used for locomotion. And one of the other really important defining characteristics of the mollusk is its feeding organ, known as a radula. And a radula is a rasping or scraping organ. That's what this is down here. And this radula is used for feeding for the most part. If a snail is a predator, it's using its radula to attack prey. And if it is an herbivore, it's using its radula to scrape the algae off of the rocks or scrape on plants. The phylum is quite diverse, and there are a number of major classes. We're only going to cover 3 of the major classes. Of those 3, we have the Gastropoda, and the Gastropoda, you're actually quite familiar with them. They include slugs and snails, the ones that you've seen in your garden. However, it's important to realize that the vast majority of gastropods are actually in the ocean. Cephalopods you're also probably familiar with. They include octopus and squids. And then there's the bivalves. Bi means 2. Valvia here is referring to shells. So the bivalves are all of the mollusks that have 2 shells, like clams, oysters, and mussels. Now, these guys exhibit a really interesting kind of basic biology. They have here a couple of the things that I have already pointed out, including the mantle. The mantle is, again, that soft tissue on the inside of the shell. And the mantle, in this image here, it's that darker blue line, which is actually going all the way around the organism. That mantle secretes the shell, which is this lighter blue stuff on the outside. On the inside here, the mantle actually forms a cavity. And this cavity is really important. It's exposed to the outside, but it's somewhat protected. So it is the place where they have their gills, and their heart actually is inside here pumping. Their waste products actually come out of here as well, which is kind of an interesting situation to have your anus, the anus being the terminus of your digestive tract, is actually oriented right over the head. Now you might think that's a horrible design, right? To basically be pooping on your head the whole time. But it actually works okay in snails because this results because of a system that causes their bodies to twist. Now, why would their bodies be twisted? What's the advantage of twisting? Well, you've actually seen snail shells before, I'm sure. And if you look at a snail shell, you'll notice that it's coiled. Well, that coil makes it so that the shell can grow and accommodate the organism and provide lots and lots of protection. But the side effect of having a twisted coiled shell is that your anus ends up being oriented right over your head. I know it's not the most pleasant thing to think about, but the disadvantage of having your anus over your head is is nowhere near as bad as the advantages you get from having a coiled shell. In addition to the shell and the mantle cavity, here's the foot on the bottom. That's what the organism glides on. And you may also know, this isn't true of land snails so much, but marine snails, if you've ever been to the intertidal zone, you'll know that these snails are capable of pulling their entire bodies back into their shell. And when they do that, marine snails actually have this small piece of shell known as an operculum. And operculum means doorway. So this actually is able to close off the entrance, allowing the organism even more protection. So here we have the operculum, here's the foot, here's the mantle, and here's the shell. And then, of course, the mantle cavity here within which the gills are situated. The only other thing I want you to know from this image here is inside the mouth, you'll notice that the scraping, rasping organ known as the radula is located in there, right there. So if I was to show you this picture on an exam, would you be able to recognize all of these organs, all of these parts of the snail body plan, especially those that are circled? Well, if you do, if you can identify them, then you're going to get this question right on the exam. Now, if I have an arrow and it's pointing right here inside the mouth, do not tell me it's the mouth. Do not tell me it's the tongue. I want to know that you remember it's the radula. Now, if you were going to design the perfect predator, what would you design? Well, you think about like sharks or lions or things like that. But, the reality is if I was designing one, I'd probably pick something that looks like this, from the movie Predator, of course. All right, so all joking aside, what are some good characteristics of the perfect predator? Well, let's say that a perfect predator should be able to grab its prey and hold on to its prey without letting it go. A perfect predator probably has really good eyesight and has a huge organ, something that it can bite and kill its prey without any problem at all. You'll notice the size of this beak compared to the hands that are holding it. This beak is probably enough to lop off a human's hand right at the wrist. Also, a good predator is going to be somewhat stealthy. That is, they're going to be able to blend in with their background and actually be able to hide from their prey items. And I think of all of these things, the most important one is that a predator must be intelligent. Yes, that's a Mr. Potato Head. And in this case, of course, we're talking about an octopus. Octopus and their relatives, the cephalopods, are among the smartest, most intelligent of all the invertebrates on the planet. In many ways, they are many times smarter than a cat or a dog. And I'll show you how in just a second. But this Mr. Potato Head is actually the toy for this octopus up in the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And it doesn't go anywhere without its Mr. Potato Head. It absolutely loves it to pieces. Sometimes it takes it apart, sometimes it puts it back together. So class Cephalopoda. These guys have either a reduced shell or they're lacking a shell, with a few exceptions, and we're going to talk about those in a second here. They have among the highest developed nervous systems in all of the invertebrates. So they're extremely intelligent. They have better vision than humans. Human eyes are actually designed backwards, of all things, but an octopus's eye is many times more acute than ours. They are all carnivores. They eat other animals, and they're able to swim by jet propulsion, although they can certainly walk around using their suckers and their arms as well. And what about that octopus intelligent? I keep telling you that they're intelligent, but what do I mean? How intelligent? Well, let's go ahead and compare them to a typical snail, which should be their cousins, right? Gastropods are their cousins. Okay, a typical gastropod has typically 20,000 neurons, 20,000 neurons in their little brains. An octopus has about 500 million neurons in their brains. That means that they have far more processing ability than your typical snail. And they are very intelligent because this number here, 500 million neurons, relative to the size of the organism, means that they have the cognitive ability that is kind of more similar to birds and mammals than they are to their other invert cousins. And for this reason, they are incredibly cunning problem solvers. I have a couple of videos actually posted on the course website on octopus disguise. And the thing that is so amazing about these guys is not only can they solve problems through observation, which, by the way, is something that your dog can't do. If you teach a dog how to do tricks, and let's say you have a dog and you're telling it to sit, and you're telling it to speak and roll over, and all these things that you've taught it, Let's imagine that you have a puppy that's on a leash and it's over there in the corner watching this. If you went over to that puppy and started doing the same thing, sit, speak, roll over, that puppy's not going to know what you're talking about. It's not going to be able to do it because each individual dog must be taught individually. Dogs do not learn by observing other dogs doing things. So they don't learn by observation. Very few animals can actually learn by observation. Octopus can learn by observation. In one experiment in particular, an octopus was taught to grab shapes, to basically grab wooden shapes, wooden three-dimensional shapes, and depending on the color and the shape, they were given a particular prize. And then they went across to the aquarium that was across the hall, to the octopus that was watching this the entire time. And in trying it with that octopus, they got it right the very first time because octopus can learn by observation. Another really interesting thing about octopus is that they, along with all other cephalopods, have nervous control over every cell on the surface of their skin. That's something that we can't do. And if you watch one of the octopus disguise videos, you'll see that it literally is blended in with the background. You can't even see it. And then all of a sudden, the animal comes to life and swims away from the camera. And the reason why is because they have a nerve that touches each skin cell, and the skin cell can either flex or relax, which either makes it white in color or blends in with the background. And they can even change the texture of their skin to resemble the background. Again, that is something that requires a huge amount of intelligence. Cephalopods exhibit some pretty interesting evolutionary trends here. And this is my daughter actually standing in front of a fossil of a cephalopod known as an ammonite. Now, we're not going to talk about ammonites in this class. These are extinct cephalopods that are no longer living. This is kind of what an ammonite probably looked like. But we do have certain cephalopods that do have shells that are still alive today. We know them as nautilus. And this is a nautilus over here. We also have cuttlefish. If you've ever eaten cuttlefish, this is what the living organism looks like. Then we have squid, and then, of course, the octopus. Well, the nautilus has been around on this planet for a very long period of time. It's probably one of the most ancient living cephalopods, and this is what its shell looks like. It has all the tentacles coming out. It has all the eyes and the siphon, and it swims by jet propulsion just like all other cephalopods. But it is a shelled mollusk. And this guy right over here, this cuttlefish, also has a shell, but its shell is internalized. It looks like that. For those of you that have any birds as pets, you go to the pet store and you can actually buy a cuttle bone. Okay, well, I use that word bone loosely. It's actually not a bone. This is an internalized shell from a cuttlefish. And it's essentially like this, but it's been highly modified and reduced, and it's now internal with all of the soft tissue of this organism on the outside. If you've ever cleaned a squid, you will also know that a squid has some hard parts too, although it feels more like flexible plastic. It looks kind of like this, and it runs down the length of this organism. So here we have an organism up here, a nautilus with a really big, gaudy shell, and then you have a cuttlefish here with an internalized reduced shell, and then you have a squid with an even further reduced shell where it's actually more like cellophane in a way. And then finally, the octopus, which has no shell at all. And this kind of illustrates an evolutionary trend towards shell loss that is pretty typical in cephalopods. Now, the last group of mollusks is the class Bivalvia. Again, those organisms with two shells. These guys are really strange. So they possess those two shells, and they are highly, highly modified mollusks. They're very different from their other mollusk cousins in that they don't have a radula. Remember, I had mentioned that the radula was actually a defining characteristic of mollusks. Well, it is for most mollusks, but not for bivalves, because these guys, over evolutionary time, have lost their radula. In addition, these guys are not predators. They are all filter feeders and suspension feeders. So they suck seawater in, filter out all of the yummy goodness, and then they pump out cleaned seawater And I'm going to circle a few features here, and yes, these are the features that I want you to know. We have the mantle, and the mantle, again, is that soft tissue, kind of depicted here as being yellow, and that mantle is secreting the shell, which is the hard stuff out here. They do still possess a foot, and in this case, because they're filter feeders, entering the mantle cavity, they have an in-current siphon where the water flows in, and then it flows through their gills so that it can filter out all of the yummy goodness, and then the excurrent siphon is where the water flows out. So this is the anatomy of the bivalve that I do want you to know, and I have a couple of examples of bivalves here. Here are scallops, oysters on a half shell with Tabasco and a shot of tequila, not too bad, mussels, and clams, as in like clam chowder. This is very typical of bivalves, any bivalves you might find in the store or encounter in the field. One interesting thing about clams is that one species of clam, or one group of clams, the giant clams, have actually acquired symbiotic algae that live in their tissues, and hence all of this really colorful stuff here. And the algae do photosynthesis, which is really cool because they're kicking out all of their photosynthetic byproducts, including oxygen and also sugars, directly into the tissues of their symbiont clam. That's really interesting, don't you think? Okay, let's move on to the next group of organisms. We're now moving over to the annelids. Annelids. Annelids are segmented worms. They are the segmented worms. And you have a lot of familiarity with one group of annelid worms, but actually the vast majority of them you probably are not familiar with. So let me go over a few of the, before we cover the taxonomy, let's go over those same questions that we have continuously asked for every phyla. Number one, what kind of symmetry? Okay, so these guys have bilateral symmetry. So we're now into pretty much predominantly bilateral symmetry. They are triploblastic. They do contain a true coelom with an actual peritoneal lining. And these guys are segmented. You can probably see that from these two worms that I'm showing you here. And body segmentation is actually a really interesting evolutionary trend because it means that whatever instructions you have in your DNA for how to make a single segment, all you got to do, it's like computer programming. You just add a little code at the bottom of the computer programming, like you would in your DNA, and you say repeat, 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 repeat. And eventually you'll end up with an organism that is segmented, just like this. Now that segmentation, that repetition of body segments, we know that to be metamerism. Metamerism is the term we use to refer to body segmentation. And now let me go ahead and continue on with a few features and then talk about the three classes. These guys have a closed circulatory system, which is actually different from other invertebrate groups, like the arthropods, which we're going to talk about coming up here in a few slides. The three classes are the polychaetes, the oligochaetes, and the hirudinians. Poly means many. Chaete refers to setae, or spines that stick out on the side. So polychaetes have many long setae. Oligochaetes, oligo refers to few or small amounts or not very many, or reduced. So oligochaetes have few or reduced short setae. The last group are the hirudinians, which are the leeches, like this picture down here. And leeches are a very diverse, highly derived group of annelid worms. The polychaetes are basically all marine. They're only found in the marine environment. They include examples that are sedentary, that is, they burrow into rock, or in this case, into coral, and they filter feed using feeding structures that stick out of their hole. But this is an actual worm that is way down buried into a tube. But there are also polychaetes that walk around, or not walk around, but crawl around. And I'm going to show you that in the very next slide. Oligochaetes you're familiar with because that includes earthworms. Earthworms are segmented worms. They're annelid worms. The group of annelids they belong to are the oligochaetes. That's the class they belong to. and then the leeches. Let me just show you some pictures here. Here are the polychaetes again, all marine. These two here are examples that actually crawl across the bottom of the ocean. And then these guys are the sedentary ones that put feeding structures out. These worms here are all embedded in coral. And you can see the setae, right? Polychaete, polychaeta. And these are large and they extend out the sides. And that's different from these guys, the oligochaetes, which include the earthworms. This right here, this picture is actually of the longest earthworm on the planet. This species is found in Australia. So they don't have any parapodia, or at least they have reduced parapodia and setae. Kind of neat. And then that last group are the hirudinians, the leeches. And we're actually, and by the way, leeches infect all kinds of organisms. Here we have one on a fish. This is one on a person. We even have leeches that infect snails. But leeches have gained a lot of notoriety in the last few decades because we use them for medical purposes too. Leeches have really complicated spit. Okay, the saliva that they produce. The saliva contains an anticoagulant. So when they bite onto you, they don't want your blood to be coagulating. You don't want platelets to be forming a clot because then they won't be able to eat it. So when they bite you, they actually spit an anticoagulant into your skin to keep the blood flowing. In addition to that, they also have in their spit a numbing agent. You see, they don't want you to detect if they're biting you, so they spit a little bit of a numbing agent into your skin as well, so you don't feel the bite very much. The third thing they have is an antiseptic. They don't want any bacteria getting into their bite as well. So that actually is one of the many reasons why you would prefer to have a leech on your wound when it's healing. In this case, this person here has had some major surgery and they've attached a leech to help, number one, keep the bacterial count down because of the antiseptic. They also are trying to keep the blood flow through this area so that the wound can heal, hence the anticoagulant. And they also would like to reduce the pain a little bit, hence the numbing agent. So leeches are actually being used more and more in medical fields. Now let's go ahead and move on to the next group. Right over here to the nematodes. Nematodes, okay. Nematodes are the roundworms. Roundworms are extremely diverse. There's lots and lots of roundworms out there. They're all bilaterally symmetrical. They have a head end and a tail end. They are triploblastic, but in this case, they don't possess a true coelom. They have a fluid-filled bag within which their organs float, but their organs are not separated out by individual layers. So hence they are pseudocoelomates. They don't have a mesentery. However, they do have a complete gut, like the annelids. Annelids also have a complete gut. Can you think of an animal that we've discussed in the past that does not have a complete gut? If you said Platyhelminthes, then you're right. Nematodes have a lot of free-living examples that live out in the wild naturally, but there are also a number of very important parasitic examples of nematodes. What's really interesting here is that these guys actually molt when they grow, which implies somewhat of a relationship between this group and also the arthropods, the crabs, lobsters, and shrimp, which we'll talk about later on. Here is one example of a nematode of medical importance. These roundworms can be found everywhere. They can be found, roundworms in general, I should say, are found in plants, they're found in the soil, they're found all over us, they're found inside of us. Most of them don't do much to us, but occasionally we do have a species which is of medical importance. And this particular one, Dracunculus medinensis, is one such example. These are the larval nematodes here, and this was taken from a blood smear. So they actually do live in your body. And Dracunculus has a very interesting life cycle. This is the life cycle of Dracunculus medinensis, also known as the guinea worm. The larvae actually lives inside of a little tiny crustacean called a copepod. And the larval cyst basically is freed when a human comes along and drinks tainted water and gets some of these copepods down in your stomach. Well, you begin to digest away the copepods, and and then the adults begin, or I should say, then the worms are freed. They enter your body, and the larvae are released when the copepod essentially is degraded away. The larvae then penetrate your stomach and the intestinal wall, and then they begin to mature in your body and reproduce. I know that sounds kind of weird, doesn't it, inside your body? The female worm is then fertilized, and she begins to migrate just underneath the surface of your skin, and she causes these massive blisters to occur all over your body until she migrates to the extremities, usually your lower legs, like around your calves or your ankles or near your toes. And then what she does is she burrows through your skin, and she causes a big hole in your skin where she puts her uterus out of your of that hole, and she begins to shed all of the larvae into wherever you happen to be walking. And if you're walking in the water, well, guess where the larvae go? They get released right into the water where they're swimming around, and they get taken up by the copepods again. And then the life cycle is completed when the next human comes along and drinks tainted water. I know, doesn't that sound disgusting? Well, it's pretty gruesome. Yes, it is. Here are a bunch of worms that have essentially everted their uteri, so you know the sex of these worms. These are all females. And they have essentially stuck their uterus out, and they are now shedding worms all over the place. Now, what's interesting is that you can actually treat this injury. Um, the worms are very delicate, so if you just reach down and grab it and pulled, you'd break the worm in half, and then the worm would die while it's inside you, and then you get this massive infection in the wound. So for the last many hundreds of years, biologists and medical doctors have figured out how to get these worms out. What you do is you take a matchstick or a short stick, and you can actually wrap the worm around the matchstick just like this, and you essentially turn it about a quarter turn, not very much, not so much that you're going to break the worm, but just enough that you put a little tension on it, and the worm actually slowly begins to come out. Eventually, you have the whole worm wrapped around it, you put a little antibiotic onto the wound, and voila, you've solved the problem. Now, I know that's not like getting rid of the worms that are all in your body, but at least it gets rid of the wound and the worm that is causing the injury to your foot. But because this was one of the first tropical diseases to ever get cured by science, by Western medicine, this is exactly why we use this symbol here to indicate the medical field. See, you thought that it was a staff with snakes and wings. No, no, no. This caduceus, that's what this symbol is called, the caduceus. A caduceus is actually probably a matchstick and a guinea worm wrapped around it. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, the symbol for the medical profession is actually a parasitic roundworm wrapped around a matchstick. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next group here, a group that is probably related to the nematodes, that being the arthropods. Love the arthropods. Arthropods are among the most diverse group of, or I should say, the most diverse group of animals on the planet. They are defined by their ability to molt. And molting is referred to, the scientific term for molting, where you essentially shed your skin, is called ecdysis. Ecdysis. It's a really good Scrabble word, guys. You should remember that one. They are probably related to the phylum Nematoda, at least at some basal level. And Nematoda also do ecdysis. They also molt. There's a whole myriad of arthropods, and there's no way we're going to be able to focus on all of them. So here, let me give you kind of a breakdown of this group here. There's well over 1 million species. We don't even know how many there are. All we know is that by current estimates, we've described probably over 1 million of them, but there's probably many more to go. Um, they have jointed appendages. Just think of a crab or a lobster or an insect. They have specialized segmentation, so it's more than just metamerism, like what we saw in the annelids that have segmented bodies. These guys have segments that now work in conjunction and form an entire section of the organism. That terminology, or I guess that development in this group, is known as tagmatization. Tagmatization, or tagma, the creation of a tagma, is the is the is the is the intermingling of segments to form an actual body. Like, for example, an abdomen of a beetle. That abdomen is considered a tagma, or the back end of a lobster, all working together. All those segments basically operating as an abdomen on a lobster. That's the part that you would eat. They also possess an exoskeleton. So unlike you and me, where we have a skeleton made of bone that's on the inside, arthropods have a skeleton made of chitin, which is on the outside. Now you might recall all the way back to the macromolecule lecture when we talked about polysaccharides, and we had actually mentioned that chitin is a type of polysaccharide. So your bony structure on the inside of your body is made out of calcium carbonate. Theirs is actually made out of a sugar derivative. Kind of interesting. So they have to molt to grow. They have to undergo ecdysis because they can't grow in small bursts like you or I do. They have to grow in large bursts and essentially throw off their old skin so that they can grow a new skin. Now, there's 5 major groups of arthropods. We have the crustaceans, the chelicerates, the trilobites, the hexapods, and the myriapods. Now, we're not going to focus in detail on all of these, but I wanted to circle a few of them here. The crustaceans and the chelicerates are predominantly marine. There are some examples that are not, but they're predominantly marine. The trilobites here, the trilobites are all extinct. They went extinct a long time ago, but they do represent a really cool group of arthropods. Then there's the hexapods and the myriapods. Hexapods include the insects, and the myriapods include the centipedes and also the millipedes. So, trilobites, these 3 right down here are actual fossil examples of these segmented, really strange arthropods that exhibit that same tagmatization. They've got a whole head region, which is actually a bunch of segments working together. They have a middle region here, which is actually a bunch of segments working together, and then a tail region down here. Also another tagmata. Here's our hexapod. Okay, not the little girl back there, but actually the praying mantis that she's holding on to. That's, again, my daughter. And then there's this kid here with an African millipede on his face. Kind of brave, don't you think? Okay, let's move on and talk about a couple, before we actually talk about the groups themselves. I'm going to do it a little out of order. We're going to do the chelicerates first, and then come back to some of the other ones. Then we'll deal, I think, with the insects last. Okay, this is what molting looks like. What you're looking at here is a crab. This lower right part here is the actual crab whose shell is very soft. What he has essentially done is backed his way out of this shell here, his old shell, which is actually smaller. And basically, here's how I want you to think about molting. Let's say that you are wearing a medium sweatshirt, and it's extremely tight on you. You've needed a new sweatshirt for a very long time, but you still have this medium sweatshirt. So essentially what you're doing is your skin is secreting an extra large sweatshirt underneath. Okay, so you could imagine for a while it would be kind of tight inside of your medium sweatshirt, that being with your skin growing an extra large sweatshirt underneath. And then what you do is you take a razor blade and cut through the back of your medium sweatshirt and break out of it like the Incredible Hulk, and then you kind of shake out your extra large sweatshirt, and then now you have lots of room again to grow. You have room to grow. That's essentially what molting is. In this case, this crab has been secreting this shell underneath for a very long period of time, for at least a few months. And he's now backed out of the back of his medium-sized shell, and he will now be taking on seawater for the next few hours to kind of increase in size at the same time that his polysaccharide chitin outer exoskeleton begins to harden. This is precisely how you get soft-shelled crab. For those of you that have ever eaten it in a sushi restaurant, essentially what they've done is they've gotten a crab just minutes after he has molted, where his exoskeleton is still very soft. Okay, let's cover that first group of arthropods, the chelicerates. Chelicerates include horseshoe crabs and also spiders and scorpions. Very strange, huh? Horseshoe crabs, huh? You've heard them before probably. Horseshoe crabs are not crabs at all. In fact, they are very distantly related to crabs. Their closest relatives are these spiders over here. Very neat. These guys are very common on the East Coast, especially around Florida and the Caribbean. And spiders obviously are found all over the place. Horseshoe crabs, though, have this really weird and curious behavior where they might live in the ocean, but they crawl up onto land so that they can lay their eggs. They lay their eggs in the sand and then they travel back into the ocean. These are among the most ancient chelicerates ever to exist, or at least the living ones that are still alive. Can you think of any advantage to laying your eggs on the beach? Well, let's think all the way back to when these guys were living in the ocean hundreds of millions of years ago, and where the vast majority of organisms at that time were all marine. Well, if you're trying to keep your eggs out of the mouths of hungry predators, why not lay your eggs up on land where there are none yet? See, at that time, there was nothing living on land that could eat eggs. So it seemed like a safe place to lay your eggs. Well, of course, now we have things that are up on land. Lots of things are on land. But these guys still exhibit that same ancient behavior. Now, the group that the spiders and scorpions belong to is called arachnida. So the arachnids are all of the spiders, scorpions, and their cousins, like this guy. This is actually a sun spider down here. These guys have two body tagma, or tagmata, if you will. They have a cephalothorax, which is their head and mid-body region, kind of like this on this scorpion. And then they have an abdomen. And the abdomen is actually what is attached to the tail here, or on this sun spider, it would be this part here. Or on this black widow, it's the actual abdomen part on which the hourglass appears. They have 4 pairs of legs, or we say 8 legs total. You might go, well, that's kind of weird. I can see it over here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 pairs. And you can even see that on this scorpion. But on this guy here, why do I see 5 pairs? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Because the first pair here are not legs. Those are actually called pedipalps, which indicates to me that this image here, this picture, is of a large male. Males have these extended mouth parts called pedipalps. The actual back 4 pair here are the actual legs. They also possess structures called Malpighian tubules. Malpighian tubules allow these guys to be successful up on land where they reabsorb water. They are among the most efficient water users on the planet, which is kind of neat. They're even better than insects at this. They also breathe using book lungs. And these are structures that kind of resemble gills, but they operate more like the way your lungs do in breathing air. So they're air breathers too, right? But they are descendant from animals that came from the ocean. Now, let's continue on to the crustaceans. Crustaceans include a lot of the things that you've eaten in a restaurant with butter and garlic. Crabs, lobsters, shrimps, even barnacles. And we're going to talk a little bit about barnacles later, but I've kind of produced a hodgepodge of pictures here of crustaceans. And they include some things that are very familiar to you, like this lobster, and others which are probably not very familiar to you, like this copepod right here. So let's go ahead and talk about one group in particular, which I think is very reminiscent of all of the crustaceans. That would be the decapods. Decapods are all familiar to you. They include shrimps, lobsters, and crabs. Shrimps, lobsters, and crabs, all decapods. What does the name mean? Deca means 10. Poda refers to legs. So, unlike spiders, which have 8 legs, decapods have 10 legs. And you can probably count that here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on one side, and then 5 on the other side. Same thing with this shrimp, and same thing with this crab. They have 5 pairs of legs, and in many of these guys, the first pair of legs is modified into a claw, also known as a cheliped, or cheliped, if you will. This guy, you can see that very easily. It's kind of modified into that nice little claw there. And, you know, in my family, lobsters as decapods have always been very important. This is actually pictures of my daughter holding lobsters. And the night or the morning after the opening night of lobster season, I like to come home with lobsters. And here is my daughter holding a lobster every year, all the way back to 2003. And let me tell you, she absolutely loves it when I show pictures of her in her diaper. Really, really great. Here's a recent one, October 1st. And I know what you're thinking. Everybody complains, is your daughter getting larger or is the lobster getting smaller each year? Hmm. Well, I'll let you guys decide that one for yourselves. Okay, cousins to the decapods include these guys, order Isopoda. Iso means same, and poda means legs. And you know these guys as roly-poly bugs or pill bugs, or they're also known as sea roaches. These guys do not possess any carapace. And we say sea roaches, but of course they're not roaches at all. They're not insects. These are crustaceans. These are crustaceans that are cousins to the decapods. Now, I know what you're saying. You've seen these guys before. This is probably what you're familiar with. These are roly-poly bugs, right, that live under the rocks in your front yard. Well, could you imagine coming home and kicking over a rock and seeing a roly-poly bug that looked like that? Yeah, that'd be kind of cool, don't you think? That's Bathynomus. Bathynomus is the largest isopod on the planet right now, and it happens to live very, very, very deep in the ocean. Um, but they are direct cousins. They are direct relatives to your roly-poly bug, which walks around in your front garden. So roly-polies are not insects; these are crustaceans, and they are the rarity. Most isopods, most of these guys, live in the ocean. A few live in fresh water, but only a very small handful of them actually live up on land. Okay, one other group of crustaceans are the barnacles, also known as the Cirripedia. Cirripedia. Cirri refers to the feeding structures, which I'm going to show you in just a second here, and pedia means legs. So these guys are come in two varieties. The first one are stalked or gooseneck barnacles, and they have a flexible stalk on the base. And what's really weird is I'm calling these guys a crustacean, but yeah, they don't look much like a crustacean. They don't look like a crab or a shrimp or a lobster, and yet these are cousins to crabs, shrimps, and lobsters. Imagine a crab that glues its head to the rocks and then builds a shell up around itself and feeds with its legs. Okay, that's what you're looking at here. These guys are descendant, and they are related to other crustaceans. And the cirri that they're feeding with are highly modified legs, essentially, sticking out of their shell. Stalked or gooseneck barnacles have this flexible peduncle, and peduncle simply means base, so that's their peduncle down there, another good Scrabble word. And the second variety here are the acorn barnacles. These guys are not flexible. Instead, they have their shell that actually comes down the sides of their body and anchors them to the rocks. And they are essentially a bunch of plates around these organisms. So, stalked barnacles and acorn barnacles, two different kinds of barnacles. These guys are sedentary, and unlike other crustaceans, like crabs and lobsters, they don't have separate sexes. They actually have um, uh, two sexes, male and female, within the same body. So they are known as sedentary hermaphrodites. Hermaphrodite meaning that they have male and female parts that are equally well functioning, but being sedentary, being glued to the rocks, presents a serious problem, don't you think? I mean, how do you make more baby barnacles? Well, you're living in a harsh environment. These guys live basically anchored to rocks where the waves are just crashing on them at all times. Well, if you're just spreading your gametes out into the water, they're going to die. They're going to get bashed up against the rocks. So you have to have internal fertilization. Well, how do you do internal fertilization if you're glued to the rocks? Well, here's the solution. Are you ready for this? Turns out that barnacles have the world record longest penises. They actually have penises that are up to 16 inches long or 40 centimeters, which, when you consider these organisms are only about half a centimeter to 1 centimeter in size, it can be basically 40 times their body length. And I know that sounds really funny, and my guess is you're probably going to tell this story at the next party that you attend on Friday night. But the reality is it has a very important evolutionary outcome here. If you are a sedentary organism and you are a hermaphrodite, the solution to your dilemma, if you must have internal fertilization to be successful, is to have an extremely long penis. So there you go. Now, before we get on to the insects, we're going to talk about their cousins here, the subphylum Myriapoda. Myriapoda. Again, myriapods are similar to insects in some features, specifically their heads, but they have this runaway tagmatization or runaway tagma, where this whole part here actually is a tagma. They've got the head and they've got all these body segments, which is different from their insect cousins. So they only have two different tagma, but they are the most closely related organisms to that of insects. So on an exam, for example, if I was to ask you if I gave you a list of a whole bunch of arthropods and I said which of these is most closely related to insects, you would know that the myriapods are the ones that are most closely related. Okay, let's move on to the hexapods, the insects. These guys, among all the arthropods, are the most successful group of animals on the planet by far. And there is no comparison. They basically represent more than 1 million species that have been described. They possess 3 body sections, so they have 3 tagmata. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. Let's use this wasp up here as an example. This head is actually made up of a number of segments, but the segments are all now highly modified to operate as one unit, a head. They also have a number of segments here in the thorax that now operates together as the thorax. And these are all separate segments here, all operating in unison to form an abdomen. All insects have this characteristic. And they also possess 3 pairs of legs. So this is interesting. This allows you a means of comparing insects to arachnids to decapods. Decapods have 10 legs, arachnids have 8 legs, and insects have 6 legs, or three pairs, if you will. Another characteristic of most insects is that they possess 2 pairs of wings. Even the ones here, if you look at this moth, there's 1, 3, 4. 4 wings, which is basically 2 pairs of wings. That's also true of this interesting insect here, this plant bug, and it's even true of bees and wasps, and of queen ants, which do fly. And same thing with this moth here. The only insect which possesses wings but not 2 pairs are flies. Flies only possess 1 pair of wings, and they happen to be among the best flyers of all of the animals on the planet. Flies are among the best. Another thing that the more highly derived insects do is metamorphosis, where they undergo a complete morphological change throughout their life. It's interesting because their DNA possesses all of the instructions on how to represent each of these morphologies, and they have to go through this timed release of new chemicals in order to change from one body form to the next. And I'll show you an example of that here. Here's an egg of a caterpillar. Okay, there's that caterpillar. Caterpillars are larvae, right? It essentially eats plants. But at some point it develops enough to where it begins to pupate, and it forms into a pupa. And inside here, there's all of this chemical or biochemistry going on, which transforms this organism into this. and eventually into that after it's emerged. Now, what's interesting is that this and this, they don't look anything alike, and yet they are the same species. If you were to compare their DNA, these are identical. I'm actually showing you two different species. I'm showing you a swallowtail butterfly and also a monarch. These two pictures are of a monarch, and these two are of a swallowtail. Okay, that's all we're going to say about the insects. They are, again, they deserve a class unto themselves. Entomology is the study of insects. So if you ever get a chance, if you are transferring to a four-year university, for example, you might get to take an entomology class. Okay, the last group of entirely invertebrate group is the phylum Echinodermata. Echino refers to spiny, and derma means skin. Like you go to the dermatologist, right? For a skin doctor. Echinodermata means spiny skin. And this group includes some things that you're familiar with and some you may not be familiar with. Sea stars. Okay, we all know and love sea stars. We all know who Patrick Star is in SpongeBob. And then there's also urchins. Urchins you might be familiar with. Sea cucumbers, maybe not so much. And then brittle stars, I'll be surprised if many of you knew what brittle stars were, but you're going to in just a second. These guys are really, really weird because they exhibit a form of radial symmetry. See, they have a central area, and they have rays coming out from that central area. And that's known as pentaradial symmetry. Penta means five. So pentaradial symmetry is radial symmetry in five rays. Sea stars have five arms, and so do all other echinoderms. They have five segments to their body, five sections to their radial symmetry. Pentaradial symmetry in echinoderms. They also have an internal skeletal system made out of calcium carbonate. So it's a calcareous, calcium carbonate bearing, endoskeleton. Endo means internal. So calcareous endoskeleton made up of little tiny bone-like plates called ossicles. I'm going to show you that in a second. Another unique characteristic of Echinodermata is they have a hydraulic system called a water vascular system. This is how these animals move. Definitely check out the videos that I have up on the course website so that you can see what the water vascular system is like in a video. And this water vascular system, this series of canals, connects up with tube feet on the underside of a sea star. This is actually very easy to see. And they're all hydraulically controlled for walking around and also for sensing or tasting the water. This water vascular system looks kind of like this. If you were to dissect open a sea star, you would see these series of channels running down the length of each of these arms. If you were to remove the water vascular system, it might look like this. And imagine taking your brake system out of your car and laying it out, just the brake system, laying it out on your driveway. This is kind of what you're looking at here, is the brake system of echinoderms. These vascular systems, these water canals, are all connected to these little water bulbs, which evert a tube foot out of here. And I'll show you that in just a second in a picture. But they have what's called a sieve plate, or a madreporite is the official term for it. And it's this hole which exists at the top of a sea star. Of course, the top of this sea star has been removed, but if it was intact, you'd see kind of a sieve plate at the top. This is where they draw the seawater in. It fills all these chambers with water, and then they pinch it off. It's kind of like the master cylinder, filling it with brake fluid and then closing it off, sealing it off. So now, when they flex any muscles on these balls up at the top, it will evert a tube foot. Looks kind of like this. Here's the underside of the arm of a sea star, and these are all the tube feet being splayed out and under control. They're full of seawater. Okay, now allows them to stick to a bunch of things. These things come lined with little pads on the underside, which allow them to stick to rocky surfaces, or even to you if you were to let them hold on to you. Okay, major echinoderm classes. We're not going to cover each of these in detail. Just suffice to say they do have that pentaradial symmetry. Here's the sea stars, which again is one that you're familiar with, and the urchins, which you may be familiar with too. Where do you see the pentaradial symmetry on these guys? if you were looking from the top, you'd actually see 5 rays. These guys over here are sand dollars. Hey, sand dollars are actually just sea stars. They're flattened out sea stars with little tiny spines on them instead of big long spines. This is a brittle star. You can see that pentaradial symmetry on them actually quite nicely. They're very, very mobile, a lot more mobile than these guys. And then this is a sea lily. Notice that it has more arms on it than a sea star. And yet if you follow those arms back, what you actually find is that 5-sided symmetry, that pentaradial symmetry. But out of each ray, it actually bifurcates and splits off into multiple arms. So it's always going to be 5 coming out like this, or multiples of 5. In this case, there's probably 25 arms here because there's 5 rays coming off of, or 5 arms coming off of each ray. Now, one that is kind of nebulous are the sea cucumbers. This over here is a sea cucumber. You might look at that and go, well, that looks bilateral to me. It looks like it has a head and a tail. You'd be right. However, it also has pentaradial symmetry. Imagine taking this urchin here and elongating it from the bottom to the top and making it like a big sausage and then laying it down on its side. That's what you're looking at here. The pentaradial symmetry is if you were looking straight on at one end of it, you'd see that it's pentaradial going around in this direction, even though it extends off in the length. So this guy here, pentaradial, but is also exhibiting characteristics that are kind of bilateral, so to speak. Okay, and there you go. I have thrown up the class names for these guys. I do want you to know these class names. However, I'm probably going to give you the common names for these as well if I was to ask these of you on an exam. The sea stars are asteroidea, asteroidea. Aster means star. Ophiuroidea for brittle stars. Ophio refers to snake-like. Holothuroidea. Holothuroidea are the sea cucumbers. Echinoidea. Echinoidea refers to the 2 species of urchins that I'm showing you here and all other urchins. And then the crinoidea. Crinoids are the sea lilies. So these are 5 different echinoderm classes. Now let's move on to the last group. We have almost made it. We're on to the last group, the chordata. This is the last animal group, and we're only going to deal with a couple of different animals within this group. Next lecture, the whole next lecture, is going to be dealing with one whole subset of the chordata, that being the vertebrates. Vertebrates are animals that have a spinal column, just like you and me and your dog and your cat and monkeys and zebras and dolphins, etc. But before we go there, we need to first talk about the last of the invertebrate groups, which happen to be cousins of the vertebrates, but they still are invertebrates. They do not possess a true spinal column. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the groups we do know. Here's the echinoderms. The echinoderms, we just got done talking about them. So the chordates, the phylum Chordata, is actually very closely related to the echinoderms. This is really where we're focusing right now. There are 3 groups within the Chordata. Of those 3 groups, 2 of them, the tunicates and the cephalochordates, are invertebrates. And they are closely related to the vertebrates. This is the lineage that you and I belong to. So you and I actually have invertebrate cousins. On an exam, if I was to tell you or ask you, can you name the invertebrates in a list, out of a list, that are most closely related to you? The answer would be you'd look for the cephalochordates or the tunicates. These are the 2 groups that we're now going to discuss. But before we go over those groups, I first want to talk about the major characteristics that define chordates. So, phylum Chordata. The 4 characteristics, 4 of them. Number 1, having a notochord. A notochord is a flexible rod that runs the length of your body along your back, or your dorsal surface. In your case, that flexible rod becomes your backbone as you're going through embryonic development, developing from a fetus to eventually being a baby and an adult. It becomes your backbone. But invertebrates, the invertebrate chordates, also possess a notochord. It just never develops into bone. Number 2, possessing a dorsal hollow nerve cord. that is running the same length, parallel to your notochord, is a nerve cord. Now, nerve cords do run the length of other animals, like annelids, arthropods, mollusks, but in those organisms, the nerve cord runs down their ventral surface, down their belly. In us and other chordates, it runs down our back, parallel with our notochord. Number 3, pharyngeal gill slits. At some point in development, all chordates exhibit pharyngeal gill slits. That is, we have gills. In the case of fish, as those organisms further develop, those gills become true gills, right? But in us, we actually exhibit gills at about 3 to 4 weeks in embryonic development. In us, our gills eventually become other things as they continue to develop, but we still do possess gills, which is reminiscent of our invertebrate ancestry. All chordates have this pharyngeal gill slit at some point in their development. Number 4 is having a post-anal tail. You might think, well, why is that important? Well, you look at all the other invertebrate groups, arthropods, nematodes, and anybody that has a complete gut. You'll notice that the anus is at the very tip of the other end of the organism. It's at its tail end. Not so in you and me or your dog or your cat. Think about your cat or your dog. The anus is actually located in front of the tail, not at the tip end of the tail. Now, that doesn't seem like it should be significant, and yet it defines our group. It is something that our group possesses that no other group has. And the invertebrate chordates also possess a post-anal tail, along with these other 3 characteristics. So let me show you, the tail extending beyond the anus. Let me show you an example of some of these organisms. Here's a tunicate, okay? And a tunicate looks very fish-like, doesn't it? Except this is an invertebrate. It is not a vertebrate organism. It possesses the pharyngeal gill slits. It's got the nerve cord running down the length of the body. It's got its flexible notochord right here, and the post-anal tail, the tail over here beyond the anus. All of these characteristics, these 4 things, define our group. And tunicates, and here's the scientific name for them, Urochordata, or urochordate, are similar to the cephalochordates. This is a cephalochordate here, Amphioxus, and it also exhibits the same 4 characteristics. The difference is that tunicates only exhibit these 4 characteristics in their larval form. You're actually looking at a tunicate larvae. Okay? This down here, in contrast, is a cephalochordate. Again, with all those characteristics, you're looking at the adult. So the adult Amphioxus, the adult cephalochordate here, is exhibiting all 4 characteristics in the adult form, whereas the tunicates are exhibiting it in the larval form. Now, just to put that into context of us, we are vertebrates. Here's a lizard, which is also a vertebrate, and it's also exhibiting all 4 characteristics, but the pharyngeal gill slits, in this case, are only exhibited in the larval form, whereas these other 3 are exhibited in the larvae and in the adults. In fish, which are also vertebrates, they exhibit all 4 throughout their life. So and by the way, if you doubted any of this, there's you. This is what a human fetus looks like at about 3 weeks in development. Here's your post-anal tail, your notochord, your dorsal hollow nerve cord, and then your pharyngeal gill slits, or gill pouches, if you will. So we have all of these things as well. Now, subphylum Urochordata, again, these guys exhibit all 4 characteristics as larvae, and they're known as sea squirts. That's their common name, sea squirts. What happens, and this is their scientific name, class Ascidiacea. So these ascidians, or sea squirts, exhibit all 4 characteristics as a larvae. And that's weird because this looks very fish-like, doesn't it? Well, what happens is this little tadpole larvae swims along in the ocean, and when it's ready to settle down on the rocks, its head end, or I use that word loosely, its head end comes down and anchors down to the rocks. As soon as it anchors down, it loses its tail, and these 2 siphons on either side begin to orient towards one side, and it develops a sedentary life. You recognize this as a tadpole-like thing. but you would never identify its adult as being tadpole-like or even closely related to you, and yet it is. These are tunicates. Here are here are a colonial tunicate. These are solitary tunicates up here, and then this is another colony of tunicates. These guys do not resemble other chordates, and yet they are, because all of those identifications come from the larval form, not from the adult. And here's how the water comes in. It comes into this organism. It filter feeds with its pharyngeal basket, which is reminiscent of their pharyngeal gill slits. And then the water flows out through an excurrent siphon. And these guys are truly amazing organisms. Another one. Here the water's coming in, and then it goes out right there. So, as adults, they are filter feeders, they are sedentary, they are stuck to the rocks. It is their larvae that we identify them as being chordates. Of course, they're chordates even as adults, right? But but you can't tell that from the adult. You have to look at their larval form to be sure. The last group here is the cephalochordates. They're cousins. These guys are the ones that exhibit all four chordate characteristics as adults. And boy, do they look fish-like, don't they? But they are not fish. These guys live partly buried in very coarse sediment. They don't have any distinguishing head, per se, and they are not vertebrates, but they are the closest thing that you can be to be a chordate, but not be a vertebrate. They exhibit striated muscle down here, which you can probably see, which is very reminiscent of fish. We're going to definitely talk about fish. They are in the next lecture. We are going to now end this lecture, and we'll pick it up with the vertebrates in the next lecture. That is the last group of chordates, the one that is, well, you can identify with because you're in that group. So I will see you all in cyberspace. Welcome back, biologists. We're going to continue our Tree of Life lecture. This is part number 2.